signed, it's enforceable. And then this is where we would have the home inspection, the lead-based paint if it was applicable. Contingencies, if it's gonna sell as is, you have a sale phone, pre-settlement, residential property disclosure. Did they go over residential property disclosure in real estate school? So if it's a foreclosure or if it's a land deal, you don't have to have a disclosure statement. All other instances you do. FHA home inspection notice, conventional financing, the FERPTA addendum, if you need that. So you just check all the appropriate boxes. And then you have the other terms to write everything in for you. So down here is where I always put in all the information in full in its entirety. And again, make a special note of that. So we have the firm license number that you can put in there. The agent's ID number, team leader name. So I make sure I have all that information filled out on the contract. Okay? You have any questions on that?
I have a question.
Yes.
What do you do with home warranty? Do you recommend that your buyers purchase it, or do you leave it up to them?
I usually ask for the seller to pay for it, and then if the seller doesn't pay for it and they want it, I say that, it's a personal decision. I have them on all my houses, so I say yes. It's if something happens, it's just a deductible and the cost of what it is up front. So I think it's good. I would not use First American. We've had nothing but problems with them. But so the next thing you do
Is that since Matt left, or?
That's because Matt left. Matt left because we had like 4 issues with them, and
Wow,
he didn't
really?
yeah.
Hmm.
Let's go. Come on, let's go back. Okay. So basically on the home inspection, again, typically on here, what we're going to have, the dates are all the same as of the contract date. I typically put 10 days. You'll see anywhere from 7 to 14 days in a home inspection contingency time frame. But 10 is usually the most acceptable one you see most of the time. If the seller doesn't have the utilities on, you can delay it. I usually say 2 days for that. If the results of the inspection are unsatisfactory to the purchaser and the purchaser's sole discretion, purchaser shall deliver to the seller prior to the home inspection deadline, and this is very important, a copy of the report and a written addendum. Agents a lot of times will just send over a written addendum, or will send over a home inspection and say, do everything on the summary page. So you'll get some really sloppy agents, they're going to screw that up. Okay? Or what they'll do is they have to provide an entire copy of the report and notice voiding contract. So if you go in, you find out there's major structural damage, or if there's roof trusses that are damaged, and the buyer doesn't feel comfortable, you can just void the contract. You can't void the contract, based by the home inspection without providing the entire report. And you'll often see that where they'll send over, we're voiding the contract, well, let us see the report. And they don't send over the report, the deadline comes and goes, that buyer has to buy the house, or they're considered in default on the contract. Okay? If they fail to obtain the inspection, or fail to deliver a copy of the report to the seller, or fails to deliver inspection addendum or notice voiding contract prior to the home inspection deadline, this contingency will expire and the contract will remain in full force and effect with no home inspection contingency. Okay? So you want to make sure you get you send the report if they're going to void the contract. In the negotiation period, you can see those anywhere from 2 to 7 days, but I usually see 5. What do you put in, Paul?
I put in 3 to 5,
3 to
depending
5.
on how fast it's going to move to settlement.
Right. So people are used to seeing those time frames. I would not accept a 10-day if I was a listing agreement. Probably wouldn't even accept a 7-day unless there's extenuating circumstances, like they were going to be out of the country or something like that. If at the end of the negotiation period, the parties are unable to reach an agreement, purchaser shall have the option to void this contract by delivering notice to the seller. I say within 3. What do you put in there?
2.
Yeah, so they have to make their decision pretty quickly. If you're the listing agent, you want 1 or 2. If you're the buyer's agent, I put in 3, just to give them some time to think about it. But the big thing is, if the seller and the buyer don't come to an agreement, the buyer can void the contract. Okay? Radon testing, I also say it's anywhere from 7 to 14 days. Sometimes you'll see 10 days and 12 days because it takes 48 hours to get
That's
the
what I
radon test back. If I put it, so you can do that like what Paul does, because the home inspector oftentimes will drop the radon report there at the house. I mean the radon canisters, and somebody will come back later and pick it up. Or you can arrange to have it done prior to, picked up at the home inspection in red, so you can remove both contingency at the same time. If the seller does not comply with the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency's testing methods by keeping doors open or windows open or whatever, you can extend settlement. I usually put 2 days there, that way the house is closed up for 2 days. All the windows must be shut, exterior doors for ingress and egress must not be left open, and whole house fans must not be used. Okay? If those requirements aren't met, again, I say 2 days on that. And then again, we have the 5 days for the negotiation period, and then 3 or 2 on the purchaser's election page. Okay? So those are pretty standard timelines for those kinds of contingencies. Any questions on that? Is everybody good? Okay. All right. Let's go to conventional financing first. All right. So again, this is very important. Contingency is typically, if you have a 30-day settlement, you put in like 25 days, right? If you have 45-day settlement, you put in 30, 35 days, okay? For the buyer to get their written commitment or conditional commitment, as the case may be, for the financing and the price and specified financing paragraph of the contract. If the contingency has not been satisfied by the deadline, then the contingency continues up until closing, unless the seller sends a letter asking the buyer to remove the financing. And the buyer doesn't remove the financing contingency or provide a declination letter or void the contract, then the contract continues. That's a new thing, right? So, if the buyer is in default, then so the contract becomes void if prior to satisfaction the buyer receives a written rejection letter. So that's one way to remove it, is you close, you remove financing contingency, or you provide them with a declination letter from the lender. The buyer will be in default whether or not the financing contingency has been removed if the settlement does not occur on the settlement date for any reason other than default by the seller. So if you have a questionable buyer and there's a chance that they may not make closing, you need to get a declination letter to the title company, to the listing company before the settlement date. So the other thing is the seller, so if the contingency has expired or has not been removed or satisfied, any delay of the settlement date necessary to comply with the buyer's lender's obligation pursuant to till of RESPA, so that's the 3 days, is not a default by the buyer. The seller may declare the contract void in writing. So if the buyer has to close later because the lender didn't disclose to them their fees on the closing disclosure, the seller could void the contract. So you have to make sure that your buyer and your lender are working in accordance with RESPA and TILR. Okay? The contract you want to do is typically contingent upon the appraisal, and we so you have that at 21 days, just like it says in the contract there. If the appraisal is equal to or greater than the sales price, the contingency has been satisfied and removed, the parties shall proceed with settlement. You typically don't want to tell the other people if it appraises for more money, because the sellers will get mad. If the appraisal is equal to or greater than the sales price, however, the buyer elects not to proceed with the consummation of the contract because the property does not satisfy the lender's requirement, the appraisal does not allow for specified financing of properties inadequate collateral, such notice must be accompanied by a written denial of the financing showing written evidence of the lender's decision concerning the property. Buyer must provide that notice of election not to proceed. Okay? So what happens here is John goes out and appraises a property. It goes to the lender. The lender could be a bank. The bank sends it to Des Moines, Iowa, and the underwriter in Des Moines says that that property does not appraise. So you have written appraisal which says yes, it appraises, but then you have the underwriter's opinion and they say it doesn't. So that's where that would come into effect. Okay? So you have to make that notice and get out of the contract quickly. If the appraisal is not equal to or greater than the sales price, the buyer elects not to proceed with the consummation of the contract unless the seller elects to lower the sales price to the appraised value. Buyer's notice shall include a copy of the written statement setting forth the appraised value of the property. So you have to basically provide them with the appraisal if they're not going to move forward because the property didn't appraise for the sales price. So the seller can lower the sales price to match the appraised price, and then you go to closing. If the seller doesn't lower the sales price, then you can get out of the contract. Or you can negotiate a mutually acceptable terms. So the buyer fails to give notice by the deadline, the contingency will continue unless the seller's option gives notice to the buyer that the contract will become void. So again, the buyer has to act quickly, or the lender has to act quickly if that's going to happen. And this is if you're going to ask the seller to pay any closing costs. And what you want to do is you want to make sure that if you ask for $10,000, the lender's fees are going to be $10,000. Because if it's only up to that amount. So we had a closing last week where the buyers asked for a $10,000 seller credit, but the lender would only allow them to use $5,500 of it. The buyer lost out on $4,500. They could have gotten a lower sales price. So you have to check with your lender to see what the closing costs are so you don't ask for too much money. All right? And that's what it says right there. If lender prohibits seller from payment of any portion of this credit, and said credit shall be reduced to the amount allowed by the lender. For the lender required repairs, the water and sewer, heating, air conditioning, personal property fixtures, wood destroying excise all have to be on and working. If the seller gets notice that they have to make repairs, and the seller doesn't make repairs, the buyer can make those repairs, and the lender can come back out and make sure they were done. If the buyer and seller don't agree to make the repairs, then the contract becomes void. Okay? But you typically want the seller to make the repairs. Any questions on that one? Okay. And then the contingency clauses addendum. The most important one on this one is really the sale of home. So on the sale of home, typically it's anywhere from 30 to 60 days, right? If you're representing the seller, you want 30. If you're representing the buyer, you want 60. You have to put the property address in there. And the seller can continue to offer the property for sale and accept bona fide backup contracts until the contingency is satisfied or removed. Okay? So, on there, it has to be a real contract to kick you out. If backup offers accepted, the seller will deliver notice to the buyer requiring the contingency be removed or satisfied pursuant to subparagraph 3 below, not later than, and typically I put in, if you represent the seller, it's 1 day. If you represent the buyer, it's 3 days. Typically it ends up with 2. So In here, this is usually 45 days, and this is usually 2. This says how much the property is going to be listed for and within what time frame. So the buyer can satisfy the contingency by delivering a ratified copy of the contract, and then or remove the contingency with a letter from the lender saying the financing is not contingent on the settlement of real estate or a lease. Okay, so a lot of times you get a co-signer, a parent can co-sign on that, or a lot of times, like I had an instance where the people could qualify to carry both houses, but they want to make a contingent on selling the house so that they don't have to liquidate a 401k. The other thing is they can show that they have the cash available to go without any financing. So if the buyer satisfies requirements, this property will survive the contingency of the buyer's property for sale. So the settlement has to occur in order for them to still move forward. In here, for these days, you can have 3 to 14 days is typically a time frame that you see in there. So if the buyer's sale of their home does not go through, they can work and try and get another contract, or they can try and negotiate something, but typically you want to have a relatively quick end date on that, so I usually put it 3. Seller will or will not accept an assignment of funds. That says that if you close at MBH, Echo Title might not accept their money or their assignment of funds, so you have to work this out in advance of that happening. But usually the seller will accept an assignment of funds. And then the other thing is in here that's important to know is if the buyer doesn't settle on the buyer's property, then the contract becomes void. So it's a last save for the buyer to void a contract and get out if their property doesn't close. Okay? And then basically that's what this property says too. It's a settlement of the buyer's property must occur in order for them to buy the house. So again, you would have the same time frames in there. It won't be delayed more than 3 to 14 days, and they will or will not accept an assignment fund. So you use this if you don't have a contract on their house, and you use this one if they do have a contract on the sale of their house. Okay? Contingent on the seller purchasing a home. It depends on if it's a buyer or seller market, but you can see anywhere from 7 to 30 days filled in on that one. A general addendum would be whatever the parties agree to. A backup contract, I would not typically put someone in a backup contract situation just because you have to get a release from it if they want to move on to another property. If you're going to be selling or buying a property that's contingent, you want to make sure you have all these boxes ticked that apply. So you'll usually see this in the fixer-upper property that we talked about a little bit earlier in MLS, or bank-owned properties, things along those lines. Estate sales, you'll see properties conveying as is. This one comes up a lot, where people want to know if they can get paid by a seller directly, if it's not listed in MLS, and that's where this would be the unrepresented seller or builder and buyer broker. This is where you get compensated without the property being in MLS. It's whatever fees you agree to. If the property is subject to a 1031, you have to put it in, the 1031 company in there. It doesn't delay closing, it doesn't really affect closing, it affects the seller of the property and not the buyer of the property. But it all has to be disclosed as the big piece of the puzzle there. Any questions on that? Very good. That's what we have for now, for writing a contract. So it's good for you to go in and practice, put these things in, and then get together with your accountability partner or your mentor and present a contract to them, filled out so that they can critique it or I can critique it and make suggestions as to what needs to be improved. All right, can you think of anything? No? All right, go sell something.